This is a long extract, but we're going to cover the writer and everything you need to know about her, the text type, the audience, the purpose, and then we'll go through not every line because we'd like to finish this before we die, but we will go through all the really important, rich bits of the text that you're going to be able to write about in the exam. So if we start off with the writer herself, Jamie Zeppa, what you need to understand about her is linked to the text type of the memoir. We are told by Edexcel that she is writing about when she was 24 years old and she left Canada to teach Bhutan. However, when she is writing the memoir, she is much, much older, and she is therefore reflecting back about her time in the country. Now, why does that matter? First of all, the way Jamie Zeppa feels at 24 about Bhutan is not the way Jamie Zeppa feels at the time she's writing the memoir. Jamie Zeppa would go on to stay and live in Bhutan and marry a Bhutanese man. So she comes to have a really deep relationship with the country and the culture. But the memoir she's writing, this extract, she has never been to Bhutan before and it's all really different and strange. What you need to understand is Jamie Zeppa is trying to capture the reality of who she was at that time in that moment, not necessarily who she is now. That being said, there can be a sort of more reflective layer to it because she is looking back on her past. So there's almost sort of two sides to the Jamie Zeppa and the voice of the writer that we've got in this text. There is the 24-year-old who knows nothing about Bhutan and actually is quite intimidated by it and feels like it's all very strange and unfamiliar. And then there's the Jamie Zeppa who's writing the memoir, who's coming from a place of much more knowledge and love and appreciation for the country. So those two narrative voices do sort of blend together in this text. That also affects her perspective in the sense that you will have heard me talk, if you've seen my other videos, you'll have heard me talk a lot about the insider versus outsider perspective. So the Jamie Zeppa of 24 was an outsider experiencing Bhutanese culture. The Jamie Zeppa who wrote the memoir is much more of an insider. Obviously she's not Bhutanese, but she has much more experience and understanding of the country. And therefore, she is trying to, on the one hand, recreate her original outsider perspective. But she does, and I'll point it out to you when we see it in the text, she does at the same time now use her insider appreciation and understanding of the country to help shape the reader's overarching big picture understanding of Bhutan. Because our audience is almost definitely an outsider. They do not know anything about Bhutan. Jamie Zeppa is therefore trying to paint a picture of something that she at the time was unfamiliar with, but also we the audience are unfamiliar with. That in turn affects the purpose of this text. Yes, it's going to have a purpose to entertain. All literary non-fiction, all fiction, all writing ever wants to entertain in some capacity. But I would say her others are sort of exploring, explaining her personal experience in Bhutan, and also explaining to her audience what Bhutan is like. Exam questions about this text are most likely going to fall either into your generic camp that Edexcel use frequently, like the writer's thoughts and feelings, or how does the writer use language and structure to interest you as the reader. If they were going to be more specific, then it's going to be about Bhutan and the Bhutanese people, or Jamie Zeppa herself. But whatever the question, you can see that the ideas are all very intermingled together and you're going to be talking about the same kind of things. When you're talking about text type, audience, purpose, and the writer, it's very interlinked to talk about Jamie Zeppa's insider but also outsider experience and that dual narrative voice going on there, and how that affects the way she presents herself, the way she presents her thoughts and feelings, and I'll get more specific about what her thoughts and feelings are when we actually analyze the text. Similarly, that affects how she presents Bhutan, how she presents the Bhutanese people, and then the audience aspect of it, the fact that our audience is unfamiliar with Bhutan, also has a massive impact on how she presents Bhutan and the Bhutanese people. So no matter the question, the ideas are all going to be very, very similar, and they are all affected by text type, writer, audience, purpose. Now that we've got that core foundation understood, we can go actually into the meat of the text itself and start breaking down our language and structure. I want to start by talking about the title, because that really foregrounds the key ideas of how she presents Bhutan itself. By saying something is beyond the sky and the earth. On a literal level, she's referring to the sort of geography of Bhutan and the fact that it's really, really high up. And she tells us later on, I forget how high up it is exactly, but she actually tells us in the text how far above sea level it is. And the fact that the geography of it is in the title is significant because of what it tells us about what really strikes her as significant and noteworthy about Bhutan. The geography is a big part of it. We're also going to see in the main body of the text, the people. So in terms of Zeppa's thoughts and feelings about Bhutan, the geography and the people are the two main areas that she covers. And you might not want to use the word geography, you might want to use like physical landscape really seems to affect her. On a more metaphorical level, the beyond the earth and sky makes it seem otherworldly. And that's another key thing that's going to keep happening across this text. She's going to keep presenting it as somewhere that's so different from everywhere else. And that she's going to link that as being partly a consequence of its isolation, but also how different the culture is compared to Western culture that she is familiar with, that she's from. There's a sort of mystery to the image. And I do also think the fact that it's beyond sky and earth does also create a sense of being out of reach, isolated, separate from everything else as well. So essentially, the title foregrounds everything. By knowing the title, you know exactly how she is going to present Bhutan in this text. We're just going to get it in a lot more detail. When we go to the first paragraph, she opens by talking about the physical landscape again. Now, obviously, it's Edexcel who have created this extract, so she might not have started her chapter with this paragraph. But because we're working with Edexcel's extract, we can analyze the structure from that standpoint. So we can analyze the fact that it opens with a focus on the physical landscape, on the physical geography of Bhutan, and how structurally that makes it really stand out as being significant in how she perceives Bhutan. If we go into some of the specific language details, this opening sentence, mountains all around, climbing up to peaks, rolling into valleys again and again, first of all has got that antithesis within climbing up to peaks and then rolling into valleys, showing the sort of extreme differences within the landscape. But that also combines with these present participles, the climbing up the peaks, rolling into valleys, that makes it feel very active. And we're going to see that happen more in this opening paragraph. There is a lexical field of present participles. These all create a feeling of active present movement that makes the landscape almost feel alive. And she really adds to that image, first of all, with little things like the repetition of again and again, and the fact that that also just makes it feel like movement is occurring. But the main means by which she does it in this paragraph is this metaphor of the giant child and its gathering of earth and that list of everything it's doing in order to create the landscape. So the significance of our giant child is it feels very mythical, something very, again, otherworldly, but also quite chaotic, because it sounds like across that image of the gathering, the armfuls, piling up rock, pinching mud into ridges and sharp peaks, knuckling, etc., it feels like there's constant change within the landscape. Nothing is predictable, nothing is the same. So across this entire paragraph, which would all be imagery, we're really getting a feel for the energy of the physical landscape, not just what it looks like, but the fact that it feels unpredictable and varied. Very tiny thing as well, I would just add to that, is when she's got the metaphor of the giant child, the listing that she does at this point of all the different actions that the little child is taking. The pace that creates is quite fast. And so I think that also adds to that feeling of just this country coming together in a really speedy, chaotic way. Now, of course, none of that is literal. She's not literally saying the landscape is constantly moving and changing, was actually made by a giant child. But I think what she's trying to convey is essentially a beautiful way of expressing the saying of like, it feels alive. What I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the comments is the degree to which this first paragraph communicates how she actually feels about Bhutan in a positive or a negative way. I think in the next paragraph it becomes a little bit more obvious. But can we interpret this as a good thing or a bad thing, or just neutral, the way that she's presenting Bhutan? Because on the one hand, you could argue that this imagery is really interesting and beautiful, and therefore it's like a positive presentation of Bhutanese landscape being so almost creative and different. On the other hand, does it create any foreboding? Does it feel at all overwhelming because of how much there is? Let me know what you think. But when we go to this next paragraph, she uses facts about her journey to convey the isolation, because we're told about the 90-minute drive, we're told about the 5 different flights to get there, and she also lists the flights that she took as a means of just, again, re-emphasizing how far away this place is. So all of those facts and that listing are about communicating the isolation. We get a little bit of detail that's starting to be about the Bhutanese culture as well, with the description of the simple pine paneled room. That's quite a small thing, but it does begin to foreground what she's going to expand on a lot more in the following paragraphs, of the simplicity of life in Bhutan, especially when compared to the Western culture that she's come from. And we have this really nice metaphor about her watching mountains rise to meet the moon. It's a really beautiful metaphor, and she uses a similar trick that she's already done by using the present tense, and that adds again to that same feeling of the landscape being very active and alive that we've already talked about. And I think also very powerful too, because it creates, mountains already often symbolize power and strength, but that active movement of the mountains rising to meet something so far away like the moon, yes, it is a metaphorical way of saying they were very big, but also that they almost seem to sort of dominate the landscape, dominate the sky. Now, obviously, with it being a memoir, she uses the first person and she's got a lot of reflecting going on. And we see that in this bit here, where she says, I used to wonder what was on the other side of the mountains and how it resolved itself beyond the immediate wall in front of you. The internal narrative viewpoint, we would expect that with a memoir. It would be very strange for someone to write about themselves in the third person. Nevertheless, the way that she's been able to use it here is to create a sense of what she's thinking and feeling at that time in a very explicit way. She can actually say not just what she was doing, but literally what she was thinking. And in this case, I think what she's thinking shows the way that she's perceiving Bhutanese landscape. And it's quite literally a case of, a feeling of mystery and wonder, because if we think about that image of a wall being in front of you, it's like there's something sort of isolating you. She feels quite cut off from everything else. She feels quite isolated, but there's also a mystery of what happens beyond these mountains as well. Now, she talks about what happened when she found out what's behind the mountains, and she discovered it was mountains, more mountains, and mountains again, and that the earth below them was a convulsion of crests and gorges and wind-sharpened pinnacles. So we've got the same technique being used in both of those bits, and that is the triadic structure. Now, the triadic structure really creates a mounting feeling that adds to that sense perhaps of being overwhelmed, possibly with how she's feeling, or perhaps creates a sense of the landscape going on and on and on. That is certainly the case with the repetition as well within mountains, mountains, mountains. And I'll leave it up to you if you think that's suggesting a overwhelming mountains and mountains and mountains, or just a distance of mountains, 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 or both. What's interesting about the crests and gorges and wind sharpened pinnacles is that's all language to do with mountains. It's a mountain's crest, it's a gorge in between some mountains, it's the pinnacles of mountains. So I would say this is actually a technique called metonymy. Now watch the spelling of this one because it's weird, where she is using the different parts of a mountain and referring to those to represent, mountains as a whole. Another way of taking this crests and gorges and wind sharpened pinnacles is mountains, mountains, and more mountains. So she's kind of saying the same thing in two different sentences. But why? And I think what she's trying to do is show that even when it is constantly mountains, it is still really varied and different, because we can think of like gorges as being the lowest point, pinnacles being the highest points. There's a little bit of antithesis in there again, like we had with the peaks and the valleys. And I think as well, her choice of that adjective in wind sharpened is really important in adding to that imagery of things being really sort of tough and difficult, and it feels very harsh and almost hostile a little bit with that image that reminds us about the sort of aggressiveness of nature. I don't think it's an accident that she talks about just past Everest, because of course the Mount Everest has within it so many connotations of like essentially extreme nature, something that is really unique as the tallest in the world. It has all that imagery of powerful, dangerous, hostile, but also incredibly beautiful. And I think she is creating that association there. Of course, geographically, they are really close together. That's her whole point and why she's able to see it from the plane. But she is also trying to create in the mind of the reader a link between Bhutanese landscape and that landscape as well of Tibet and the Everest. She's painting a picture of that sort of geographical region, and that Bhutanese landscape very much fits in with that. So overall, from everything we've seen about the landscape from these first two paragraphs, the adjective that stands out to me as how she feels about it, or the two adjectives, I guess, would be awe and unique. And I think you can break that down in the sense that the awe comes from how, it feels a little bit intimidating with how overwhelming it is, how intense it is. But at the same time, it's also incredibly beautiful. There's perhaps also a little bit of awe that comes from the mystery of it. You could perhaps make that its own sort of separate point or include that within the awe. And then of course it feels very, very unique. It is simultaneously varied, really varied as to what you can find in the landscape, and yet that is very much what makes it unique and different from anything else. As we go to the next paragraph, her focus is going to now shift to be more about Bhutanese culture and the people. So arguably still on geography, but rather than physical geography, we're now shifting to the human geography of Bhutan. There's only two small things I want to say about this paragraph, and then we're going to move on. The first is the description of what she had for breakfast that morning, of the instant coffee, powdered milk, plasticky white bread, and flavourless red jam. What this is very sort of subtle, but what we can pick out is the fact that this is beginning to foreground, and we'll see it expanded in the next paragraph, that one of the consequences of the isolation is they don't have that access to global goods in the same way that other countries do. What these foods symbolize is your basic, easy to transport goods. There is no luxury here. It's important for me to stress that is the case with the aspects of Western culture that appear in Bhutan, because what we're going to see as it keeps going is a big difference between the beauty and amazingness of Bhutanese native culture versus what they have managed to import from other cultures around the world. And what they've managed to import food-wise is not great. That's of course a consequence of their physical geography and how isolated they are, but is part of painting that picture of just the Bhutanese culture being so dominant and being so much more accessible than things from other cultures. The second tiny detail I wanted to pick out is again about the narrative voice, because she talks about the other people she's with being ecstatic about Bhutan and she stayed close to them, hoping to pick up some of their enthusiasm. So that contrast between her and her peers is just a really easy detail for seeing how she's feeling about Bhutan and that she is not enjoying it so far. And if we think about why is she not enjoying it so far, well, we can see from what we've had, it feels really different from what she's used to. Again, she's come from Canada and it's quite intimidating, overwhelming, so on. In this next paragraph, it's essentially a statement of facts about Thimphu and also the wider Bhutanese culture. Of course, we're dealing with literary nonfiction where our writer has cherry-picked her facts in order to create a particular presentation of Bhutan. And the presentation that we get is exactly what I've just been saying before, a beautiful native culture, but also not being anywhere near as technologically advanced as the Western world that she has come from, and also being sort of having a limited access to the more modern cultural aspects that you might find in other countries around Bhutan or just around the world. And there is often a blending between fact and her opinion that's quite effective. And we see that in this opening sentence, that Thimphu's official population is 20,000 and it seems even smaller. So of course, the population being 20,000, a fact, it seems even smaller, her opinion. So she's blending the two there in order to convey her ideas. And of course, in this case, she's trying to communicate that feeling of it being very slow paced, very small community, very, very different from the Western world she has come from. We've got this sentence, it doesn't even have traffic lights. Now, there is a fact, it doesn't have traffic lights, but the use of that word even immediately adds an evaluative tone to it that I would say is a sort of tone of surprise that it doesn't have what she would consider. We can think of traffic lights as almost symbolizing fairly basic and very widespread and common technology that you would find in countries around the world. And so the fact that they don't have those for her is a symbol of just how simple life in Bhutan is. We then have that fact of no traffic lights being contrasted with what they actually have, which is the blue-suited policemen with their graceful hand gestures. What's interesting about the image of the incomprehensible but graceful hand gestures is it comes across as a culture where beauty is a priority over efficiency, which of course is what a traffic light would achieve. And the reason I say that is because, of course, if something's incomprehensible, that's not necessarily an effective way of dealing with traffic compared to what an actual traffic light would be. There's a sense of things feeling very uniform because we're told that the buildings all have the same pitched roof, and we're also told that the shops seem to be selling the same things. So there's a feeling of uniformity in the culture. Now, that uniformity is not necessarily a bad thing because, of course, the imagery that she uses to describe the buildings, the windows and beams painted with lotus flowers, jewels and clouds, very beautiful imagery. Notice the little factual details that again present it as a much more simple culture. I'm actually going to very quickly take a pause here to stress a way that I don't want you to phrase this idea. Do not phrase it as Bhutan is less civilized than the Western world. I can understand why you might, but there are very negative connotations behind that kind of language, especially when talking about cultures that are different from Western cultures and describing them as uncivilized in comparison to the Western culture. I understand what you're trying to say, but that's not the word we want to use. Something she's going to show us about the people in a minute is they are very civilized. They are incredibly polite and well-mannered and great people. You could perhaps argue, and this is me slightly getting ahead of myself here because we haven't analysed enough to fully prove this, but I'll put the argument out there now and then you'll see how we can fully prove this later. There is perhaps a undertone to this of that civilized issue, of a Westerner going to a non-Western place and viewing it through that civilization angle. and perhaps negatively judging somewhere because it doesn't have the technological advancements that a Western place would. That being said, when she gets to know the people, she comes to much more appreciate that actually civilization is not just about technology, and she comes to really admire the people and how civilized they are. So there is arguably, you would have to do this argument very carefully to not come across like you are insulting the Bhutanese people, but there is an argument to be made that there is an undertone of a sort of Western gaze, Western judgment of a non-Western culture, and she almost learns herself and stops being so judgmental about somewhere being different, and instead comes to appreciate that civilization takes many forms. Anyway, back to the actual nitty-gritty of where we are up to. We're told that the shops are one-storied. That's just another like very small detail that adds to that feeling of it being really different from the Western world. If we think about our, countries of skyscrapers and tower blocks and all the rest of it. Ditto with the description of things being wooden, much more simple materials. Now, in the list of things that the shops are selling, it evokes a similar effect to the list of the food that she had for breakfast, in the sense of it being very simple, things that can handle being traveled over long distances because of how isolated Bhutan is. And like I said before as well, like with our stale soft cookies from India, what they are able to get from other cultures is not pleasant and is not nice, and actually native Bhutanese culture is much more beautiful, much more enjoyable. Next, she tells us that there are more signs of the outside world than I had expected. That's more of that slight surprise tone that we had earlier. What's interesting though is, of course, the surprise is like of opposite things. So with the traffic lights, it was a surprise that it's not as advanced as she was expecting. And then the signs of the outside world, there is more cultural advancement than she was expecting, because there's more of a feel of that globalization and other cultures being present. That being said, I have done some deep diving on these cultural references. That is the name of the technique, by the way, is cultural references, so that we can better understand the significance behind them. Zeppa was born in 1964, which means at this time when she is in Bhutan at the age of 24, it is 1988. Willie Nelson. His peak heyday was around the 1970s, so the music is seen to be a bit on the outdated side, but not aggressively so. Like if we think about from 2025, music that was released and was at its heyday 10 years ago or so, you're talking like peak Rihanna, but nor would it be considered like the latest release. Similarly, the Rambo poster, Rambo was released in 1984. So 4 years before the time that Zeppa is writing. So it's not really old, but it's also not the latest release of what's coming out. So there's this feeling that the outside cultural influences they're getting are a little bit dated, that in turn reflects how isolated they are, because it just takes so long for things to reach them. And she herself says that these signs of cultural infiltration are few, but they are startling against the Bhutanese-ness of everything else. Now, of course, the startling, that's her feeling about it. That's not a fact. And what that tells us is perhaps how dominant the Bhutanese culture is, and how distinct and different it is from these Western cultures, which is why when you see something from a Western culture, it feels out of place, it feels weird. The next thing we're going to talk about is this paragraph with the town seeming very old. There's an interesting contrast going on here. On the one hand, the imagery of it looking very old with cracked sidewalks and faded paintwork creates an image of it being quite dilapidated. However, that is contrasted with the fact that actually it didn't exist 30 odd years ago. So actually, this is very new and modern. I think this contrast is perhaps part of showing that this place is so unexpected. Nothing is what you would expect to be like what you find anywhere else. That's part of its uniqueness, you know? It's new and yet feels old. And that feeling old is, yes, part of things being a bit on the dilapidated side, but also that existence of the very traditional Bhutanese culture that we've got throughout it, because we have this imagery in the next paragraph of the fortress and it being built in the traditional way. And there's this real sense of simplicity and tradition and, you know, things again before massive technological advancement. And then of course you've got the imagery of the terraced fields and the forest and the river. So it feels like somewhere still very connected with nature, which is again very different from Western cities, because that's the thing to remember about Thimphu, is this is the capital. We have this quote at the end of that paragraph from the field director, Gordon. Now, what Gordon symbolizes is a sort of Jamie in many years' time, in the sense that he represents a former outsider, someone who is from the West, but now understands Bhutanese culture. So he's like he has that insider perspective of the Western culture and of Bhutan. What is significant about Gordon is this quote that he says to Jamie, where he says, Thimphu will look like New York to you when you come back after a year in the East. So of course the implication of what he's saying is that Thimphu is actually very advanced compared to other parts of Bhutan. However, Jamie contrasts that with her own thoughts by saying, it will never look like New York to me, I think, which again, she's saying it will never feel advanced to me. So New York symbolizes that Western advancement, Western cities, Western civilization. We then move on to a slightly questionable paragraph. Would this kind of writing be accepted in 2025? Don't think so. But anyway, a description of the people. And they are again described in quite a uniform, homogeneous manner, because she talks about them as if they all kind of look about the same and dress exactly the same. And we're told that they are a very handsome people. Now, across this imagery, you've got a lexical field of laudatory adjectives that represents the fact that she feels really positively about the people in a quite different way to how she feels about the landscape of Bhutan, the physical landscape, and also the town itself, because we've got handsome, beautiful, aristocratic, gentle, and then also just the general imagery of what they look like with the almond-shaped eyes and the high cheekbones. It's beautiful imagery, isn't it? It's painting the picture of beautiful people. She also uses the actual Bhutanese language when talking about their traditional dress. That adds to that feeling of how dominant the native Bhutanese culture is. Even what they wear is usually their clothes, their native culture. That feeling of it being a very homogenous culture, that means, you know, everybody's from the sort of same background, fits as well with that information we get about the other foreigners. We know they are here, and there's a small but friendly expat community. With that information, we get a sense of it being a very homogenous culture. She then has this bit where she has the anecdote of the young man who speaks impeccable English. Now, of course, what's interesting about the impeccable English is it contrasts with what you would expect from a homogenous culture with minimal outside influences. So it again just adds to that feeling of this place, it's just never what you expect. She has this list which is pulled part of our lexical field of laudatory adjectives of their dignity, unself-consciousness, good humor, grace, and she can find no single word to hold all of my impressions. But she really appreciates the Bhutanese people in a way and likes them in a way that she has not necessarily liked the landscape and the other aspects of the culture. It could perhaps be, if you think about the sort of welcoming feel that all of this description gives versus the much more hostile feel that the environment gives, that could perhaps be a reason we could argue for why. What I think is also interesting about the way she describes the people is she's able to be much more explicit and literal about the people in a way that she wasn't able to about the landscape. The landscape, it was much more metaphorical, the way that she wrote about, the mountains rising to meet the moon and the giant child and all that kind of stuff. And what I think that reflects is that she feels like she better understands the people in a way that she doesn't necessarily understand the landscape, and therefore she is able to be more literal in how she talks about it. She knows exactly what she thinks and feels about the people, whereas the landscape is such an overwhelming feeling that it's almost easier to communicate it in metaphorical language rather than literal. We then have this big paragraph where she provides all of these facts about the history of Bhutan. And I don't want to necessarily zoom in on any particular language here, but I think we should just talk about the bigger picture techniques going on. So yes, facts, but why these facts? Why is she choosing these facts? And I think what these facts communicate is the fact that Bhutan has a long and ancient history, and that part of that long and ancient history has heavily been affected by the isolation created from their geography. You've also got in that section where she lists all the different names that Bhutan has had, they are all about evoking that same kind of feeling we've had from her descriptions of Bhutan before, this feeling of beauty and mystery at the same time, because you've got beauty in things like, Lotus Grove, Rainbow District, Blooming Valley, etc. And actually more of that mythical feel that we had from the metaphor of the giant child, because you've got the thunder dragon, you've got the gods, and of course you've got lots of references to nature as well, with the pines, fruits, the medicinal herbs. So it's all that kind of feeling that she has been creating about Bhutan. She's showing us that this is the way Bhutan has been felt about for a long time, which simultaneously shows that her opinion is not necessarily like an odd one out or a unique one. She is fitting, her view of Bhutan fits with how many outsiders and the Bhutanese themselves have viewed Bhutan, and also fits with this idea that Bhutan has stayed very traditional, stayed the same, because the implications of its names throughout history still feel like they apply today being 1988. She actually explores in this final chunk historical anecdote of when the West tried to colonize. So the historical anecdote of the relationship between the West and Bhutan is designed to be an example of what she explicitly says at the end of it, the preservation of its independence. And I think what she is trying to show via this anecdote is it is not by accident that Bhutanese culture has become the way that it is, with it being very simple and traditional. It is by choice. And I think that's important in the perception of Bhutan, because it's not like they're some small-minded country that has chosen not to take on technological advancements and has chosen to avoid modernity. What it's showing is that they have a uniqueness that they are proud of and always have been proud of throughout their history. And they don't need the other cultures. They like what they have. And that, of course, is quite a different image to what we are used to in global history. As she points out herself, with the rest of Asia being overrun by Europeans of varying hue, Bhutan is again unique in managing to avoid all of that and stay independent and true to its own culture. So if we think about the way that she presents Bhutan, then we've seen more of what we've already said about the awe, the unique, the mysteriousness of it all, but also with the way that the people are presented. We've got an elegance, we've got being very civilized. Note that being a person being civilized has a different has a different definition to a civilization, but they are very linked, and they feel a lot more welcoming. So in that sense, there is perhaps a contrast between our more hostile, intimidating landscape and our much more gentle, kind, welcoming people. You can also say of their culture as well that it's a culture of tradition, simplicity. It's very unique from the rest of the world, and it's also very homogenous. It's very uniform. Everyone is sort of quite similar. And a key argument that Zeppa is trying to make, especially towards the end of that extract, is that this perception of Bhutan is not just her perception. This is how everyone perceives Bhutan, and therefore perhaps she would argue is true to the realistic presentation of Bhutan. This is the way Bhutan is, because we've seen throughout history Bhutan be perceived this way.